right on to Christie is going to talk to us about supports for youth with anxiety. Thanks, Christie.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm Christie Gause-Bemis, and a little introduction about myself. Right now I'm working as an education consultant with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. And so we work on two very specific projects. The Safe Schools, Healthy Students project, which is in Beloit, Racine, and Menominee Indian school districts. We can pilot specific programs to help support mental health in schools with those projects. And then Project Aware is in Adams Friendship, Ashland, and Milwaukee. And so the gist of those projects are to provide safe schools, violent-free schools, mental health supports, access to mental health care. With Project Aware specifically, I run the Youth Mental Health First Aid component throughout the state of Wisconsin. And we'll talk a little bit about that as one of the supports that we'll talk about for anxiety. But by history, I have been a psychotherapist for the past 12 years before coming on with the department. And my big role with that was bringing in mental health clinics into schools. And so at the start of doing that in 2002, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 that I'm aware of in the state. And now there's over 300 where providers are actually going into the schools and providing mental health supports, which increases access, less time away from class, right? And then more collaboration, hopefully, between the provider and the school, where a lot of the behaviors that we see or the mental health challenges that we see in school are kind of manifested there, and they can get some supports. So those are the things that I'm involved in right now. I've also been a county social worker. I've been a treatment foster care social worker. I've been working in home doing autism, and there's a huge intersection between anxiety and autism. And some of the clients that I would see in my private practice they would have autism, but they were primarily coming in to see me for anxiety issues. And so I'll be talking about anxiety today broadly, but knowing that it definitely intersects with the autism spectrum disorder. There is a high comorbidity with the two. And so the overview is just whenever I can get a chance to, we talk about the school mental health framework, so I'll be sharing that a little bit with you and kind of wrapping that around the anxiety. Talking about how we can motivate school staff and leaders to engage in mental health supports and teams and working with our youth. And then practical tools, hopefully, to support students, families with complex needs and anxiety specific today. And so this is where you can find the school mental health framework on our DPI website. Sometimes DPI is a little hard to navigate the website, so I provided the website link there. And we know that 1 in 5 of our students are standing in front of us every single day as educators with mental health challenges and needs that might interfere with their academics. And so we know that in order to increase their social emotional skills, that will also increase their academics. If you're sitting in class and you're anxious and you're thinking about maybe if your mom is safe at home or what's going to be happening during the lunch hour, if you're going to be able to sit with your friends, and anxiety is kind of permeating throughout your body in that way, you're not exactly thinking about the math lesson or the science lesson or what's happening, with your reading. And so that's why we know that it's very important to have mental health supports in our schools. We recently, just an update at DPI, we recently hired a new emotional behavioral consultant who will be starting, I believe, towards the end of March. And then they've also combined that role with autism. And so she comes in with a lot of experience. I'm not going to say who it is yet because I don't know if they've publicly announced that. You just know it's a she. So this is really the school mental health framework, and it's hard to read like all the little things, but I just want to show that we kind of follow the tier. So if people are familiar with PBIS, we did that, for a reason, that it's not a new innovation or initiative, because teachers often will have kind of initiative burnout, like, oh, the next new thing. This is supposed to be overlaying what's already out there with the PBIS framework. And so we'll be talking about anxiety. What I've done is I've created my anxiety talk and PowerPoint to go along the tiers, so it just kind of makes a little bit more sense, because anxiety can be on a continuum. And there are kids with some anxiety, and then there's kids with intense anxiety. And so we'll be talking a little bit about what kind of supports are needed at each time. But when I lay this foundation, and Hugh will be proud of me to put this right in the forefront, is the need for the parent collaboration as we move forward. So we're not just talking about school supports, but if we ignore the parents or the families that are involved with the kids, or the community supports that are involved with our kiddos that are dealing with anxiety, we're missing a big chunk of information and supports that we can really help to increase our work. So whether you're out there listening as a provider, as a school personnel, or as a parent, families are in the forefront. So we need to listen to our families, because often they can provide us with data or material to do our jobs better. And then there's this focus of building on relationships rather than providing programs. When I was first starting out as a school social worker, I was told to do a Love and Logic program. And so I would have my parents come into the library and co-facilitate with somebody else, another expert in the field of Love and Logic, even though my own kids were probably melting down in my shopping cart right before I came to teach the class, right? And when I would leave the class, I would walk out, and the parents would be standing around in a circle outside their cars talking at length. Like, I was long gone, pulled away, probably at home and in bed by the time they were done talking. And I really started recognizing parents aren't seeking experts in front of the room. Parents are seeking support from one another. And so I started running my classes, workshops, whatever you want to call them, as more of support circles, and having parents have the time to talk about what their needs were versus talking at them. And that was just a really big transition in my work. And so I encourage, if you're working with families, well, when you work with families, because it's not an if, that we really incorporate that kind of process with them. We can highlight their strengths and encourage families to experiment with new practices. So families are looking for help and supports. We can offer some and encourage them to experiment with them, but they generally know best of what can work with their child. And basically it's about the relationship. It doesn't matter what tool I pull out of my pocket and work with a parent or a child with anxiety. If I don't have a relationship with that child, or I don't have a relationship and connection with that parent, and they can't feel my compassion or my empathy about the situation, no cognitive behavioral intervention or newfangled tool I have is going to work. It's all about connection. And really about empowering our parents to be on the voices. I run a parent advisory work group, and I want parents in there because they're leading any of the products that I'm creating or things that I'm doing. I run past my parent work group because they're leaders in the state then, and that's engaging them in a much more deep, powerful way so that they can have a voice in policy changes and initiatives. So so that we're on the same page when we talk about anxiety, and I love that Hugh talked earlier about this gives us shared meaning. If a client is coming into my office and they've previously been diagnosed with a specific phobia versus post-traumatic stress disorder, it is a way to communicate between providers, but it definitely is not the whole story. And so when we start believing that people fit in categories and labels, we lose the person in front of us in the unique way that their anxiety might be manifesting for them. And so I really want to frame the discussion. This is not an exhaustive list, and some would say obsessive compulsive, does that really fit on there? But definitely anxiety intertwines with that. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it gives us a shared meaning and a common language to understand one another of what the child might be dealing with. So we're going to move into what kind of supports are at the universal level. And this is really the level that we have the most, I think, impact, but it's probably the least amount of time we spend on things. We always are looking at those really intense kids, But I feel if we did a better job down here, we wouldn't perhaps have really intense issues showing up in our school settings. And so a little anxiety is important. If I didn't feel a little anxiety coming in and speaking in front of people this morning, there would be something wrong with me, right? So it motivates me. I get my act together. I get my PowerPoints to Tim on time, and hopefully, all goes well. In the shower this morning, I might have been thinking about, oh gosh, this is, do I have everything together? Did I look over my notes? Do I have everything? And that helps me. But when we're talking about anxiety with kids, we'll talk about what it looks like a little different at the tier 2 and tier 3 levels and what it sounds like a little differently. So anxiety can look like nervousness, right? Trembling, yes. Maybe some constant movement, and that's why a lot of times misdiagnosed ADHD or something like that happens, because they look so similar, everything looks so similar. It could be stressed out, feeling overwhelmed, could be nervous laughter or fidgetiness. But I also want you to think about anxiety. It could be anger or outburst, right? And it could look like defiant or refusal. And it also could look like, I see all the time, oppositional. Those are actually some of my most favorite kids to work with, oppositional kids. Because there's usually something, a much bigger picture, underlying the labels that we give behavior. It could look like perfectionism. So a thought would be like, if I'm not good at doing it right away, then why bother? If I fail once, then that's going to tell me that I'm going to fail again. And so some of the adults around anxious kids can start feeling hopeless, frustrated, maybe even angry or anxious themselves, and there's a strong desire or need to control. So an anxious dialogue in the morning before coming to this talk might have sounded more like, oh man, the last time I did a talk, I forgot this whole big piece of it. That's going to happen again. Why do I even bother going? Maybe I could call Tim and tell him I have the flu and I can't talk today and I shouldn't show up because, things are just going to go wrong. And so that's the difference between a slightly anxious dialogue that motivates you to really be prepared and do a good job, and the difference between a dialogue that can shut our youth down, that can get them tapped out during a math discussion, that can take them out in social areas. Even getting on the bus can seem absolutely unbelievable, right, for the day. And so when we look at the universal, I want to think about it this way, in that approximately 25%, and I put where I got this from, of 13 to 18-year-olds have had an anxiety disorder in their lifetime. But the emphasis I want you to see in this slide is that we know in studies that universal preventions and strategies can reduce symptoms for all children and has beneficial effects for children at higher risk. And so that's really a powerful thing to be thinking of, that if we had universal shifts in how we did things, that it would impact a lot more students, and they wouldn't have to move up the tiers or have the anxiety be very debilitating towards their academic or even just their life goals, their life desires that they have. So we know cognitive behavioral treatment works. We know cognitive behavioral treatment, including the family, works even better. And there's also evidence that shows that our interventions can significantly reduce anxiety and diagnoses around children if we use some of the universal practices that I'll share. So these are some of the ones I've identified. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a list I think that's important to take a look at as a starting the conversations place. And as we look at this list, Hugh did a good job of mentioning Ross Green's work, but his work really is intertwined in our school mental health framework in a significant way. That oftentimes, and I know that I was guilty of this when I first started out as a county social worker working in an alternative school for 9 years, when a student was defiant or resistant, That's how we labeled them. And we didn't look any deeper than that. We just created behavioral supports to try to move that student to a place that that felt good for us. But with Ross Green's work, he really says it's a shift in perspective, not in that kids would do well if they wanted to, like they're somehow manipulating us, but kids would do well if they can. And that's a huge shift in perspective at the universal level for people to have when working with anxious kids. I've had experiences with my own children, and my stepson, when he was younger, would throw these major temper tantrums. And it wasn't until he was later on middle school, and now he's a senior graduating, that I really realized, looking back, how much those were related to his anxiety over the situation. Worrying about feeling left out, worrying if the older siblings would pick on him in front of somebody and make him look stupid. All of those kinds of things were happening in his head at a very rapid pace, and that was causing some of the behavior. And so if we would have looked a little deeper in the knowledge that I have now, what I know, right? You don't know what you don't know. There would have been a lot of different interventions that we would have maybe tried as a family at that point. So the trauma sensitive schools is right now there's 14 modules in the tier 1, and I put the link on there, and it's available for anybody to take a look at. There's links on family engagement, and then there's links on emotional regulation right now. So these are modules that anybody can take a look at, whether you're a provider or working in the schools, to really help support this perspective shift of that it's a skill deficit. That if kids could cope with their anxiety, they would, but they don't have a pocket full of coping skills. And so that our job is to give them that pocket full of coping skills in life so that they can better manage some of the symptoms that come out of anxiety. A lot of calls that we get in the Student Service Prevention Wellness Department division at DPI are on bullying. And I see it with my own 14-year-old daughter, the cyberbullying. I mean, you're going to bed with instant Snapchats coming at you about who you are as a person, and then you're expected to show up for school the next morning. And so if we had our policies in place and actually followed them, what would that look like, and how might that prevent some of the anxiety that kids are coming to school with about what might be happening at school? And just the overall climate of our schools and at home, if they're welcoming, if kids feel like they have a voice. All of those things are at the universal level of supports. We have a lot of things we can do environmentally with structures, ways that we run our classrooms, foreshadowing what's going to be happening, especially when you have the intersection of the autism in there, foreshadowing what's going to happen, increasing skills and coping skills, and then weaving mental health curriculums throughout our day. That it's not just a health class that people take as part of their day, but that it's the whole concept of wellness is talked about from the first week to the last week of school throughout the time that we're in school. And also you as a role model. I often will share a story where I was working with a young youth in my office, and he had autism but was coming to me for anxiety, and the tornado alarm went off outside. I'm not particularly fond of tornadoes. It's probably right up there with one of my bigger fears in life. And so my job right at that moment was, how can I model how you emotionally regulate yourself as an adult, and how do you get to a safe place. And so if we can model as adults our own management of anxiety and really name it and say, boy, I'm feeling a little anxious right now, so I'm going to take a couple deep breaths, that's a really powerful thing when youth can see that we do exactly what we're asking them to do, I think. And then just that, I can't overemphasize the connections and relationships with kids, that they won't trust you with what's underlying their behavior if you don't have that connection and that relationship with them. The WRAP plans are Wellness Recovery Action Plans. I put that at the universal level. They'll show up again at the tier 3 level. I'm really an advocate of when a student starts school, the first week or two, they should all have wellness plans, not just the kids that we identify as needing the supports, but all kids. Because what I want teachers to really be talking about in their classrooms is, maybe today Johnny's having a bad day, but tomorrow it might be you. And so if we all had wellness plans and we knew that Johnny's going to be off on Tuesday, and he's using, his skills. You might be off tomorrow. What skills could you use? I think that can be really powerful. Now, I added this to it, and it's not on my slide, but I'm going to add the pyramid model for early childhood. And this is a shout out to whoever gave me a review at the last time I did this. Like, what about the little ones? I was able to witness the pyramid model in work at a school in Racine Unified School District. And basically what it is it's just providing very clear, conscious, consistent messages to the littles about what the expectations are for the day. But also I got to see, like, in their classrooms, they would have emotional regulation places, safe spaces for them to go. And a lot of them were like crawl spaces that they could go under and then kind of shut themselves in. I talked to so many teachers in early childhood daycare centers all the way up to 4K and kindergarten, and the kid that's like got themselves, under their desk, right? That's usually anxiety. It's avoiding something that's happening or just being completely dysregulated, and so they often will find crawl spaces. And so providing those safe spaces as a proactive measure is so important. And that's just part of the pyramid model. It's a whole big thing that we're doing, piloting in some schools, but I really see that it has significant value. Also, I've seen teachers use stickers at the beginning of the year where they're making sure that all of the kids are having connections, and so the stickers are given to the kids on a board in the teacher's lounge perhaps before school starts. These are kids I know I have a connection with. Any kid that's not missing, that does not have a sticker, then that's a kid that I know in the first week or two of school I need to connect with. Because again, that connection at the universal level is so important. And that's a really good technique that I've seen schools use to increase their connections. My daughter just started the Monona Grove School District, and I know there's a couple Monona Grove people here. She started last year in 7th grade, probably one of the worst years for a girl to start a new school and new friendships. And when her teacher, Mr. Graham, pulled her aside within the first 2 weeks and checked on her, I never heard the end of it. She just talked about how that made her feel special and important and connected, and she knew she could go to him and talk. I think we undervalue the connections that we make with our kiddos and how important that is. And it takes so little time, right? Just a little 5-minute chat in the hall. How are you doing? You making friends? Now we're going to move into interventions for some, right? Some of the kids that are having maybe more issues or concerns or interference in their academics, their friendships, their social skills, because of the anxiety symptoms that they're having. And so when I think of this, I think of 5 different things. That it's important when somebody's having anxiety that we don't try to rationalize, right? If my little is saying, the peas cannot possibly touch the potatoes. Okay, all right, I got it. Peas cannot touch the potatoes. Because if we try to rationalize at that moment that somebody's having anxiety, it's really discounting the experience that they're having. The second thing I think of is to validate their experience. I can totally get why the peas should not touch the potatoes. I validate that you feel that way. It doesn't even have to be your perspective. And I think people think that if I validate, then I'm agreeing with them, and I'm saying, no, you're understanding them, and you might have a different perspective, and that's okay. The third thing is that you maintain your own cool. And so I always have 4 questions in a crisis that I kind of ask myself. And the first one is, what am I feeling now? Because if we're getting ramped up as we're providing care and support to somebody with anxiety, we're not doing them any good at all. And so what am I feeling now is the first question I ask myself. The second is, what is this child feeling, needing, or wanting? Knowing that all behavior has meaning, and we need to get at the unmet needs, feelings, maybe even the trauma, wired response that the child is having right now. The third question I ask myself is, how is the environment contributing? So if there's an audience, do I need to have the audience go? Do I need to isolate the conversation in some way so that it saves space for this child, and they can re-enter back into the routine better. And then the last question is, how do I best respond? And a lot of times as adults, we start at, how do I best respond? And so if we can slow down that process a little by asking those questions, what am I feeling now? What is this child feeling, needing, or wanting? How is the environment affecting? And then respond. It's just a better practice, I think, and you'll have better outcomes. Another thing to consider is just leading with unconditional love, compassion, empathy. I know Brene Brown has a great video that you can watch around empathy and what empathy is and what it isn't. And I just really encourage you to Google that and watch that. It's a great way of approaching anybody that's having a mental health crisis or just an emotional crisis. And then the other big emphasis is, don't pretend that it never happened. When a child is in an anxious place, right? When they come down, I think that we can do one of three things at that point. We can ignore it and pretend that it never happened, and then there's no new valuable coping skills for that child, right? They don't know how that same incident will happen again and again and again, and that will be their response. Or we can even do more damage, where we can debrief with that child and place the blame on the child and do damage. But there's this whole other place that we can go after an anxiety, they're coming back down to baseline, which is talking it through and talking about what could happen next time differently. What support do you need from me? What were you feeling at that time? What was maybe happening through your head, depending on their age and whether they're able to put thoughts to how they were feeling. And I think that's a really powerful place to be, is after a crisis, there can be really rich opportunities for growth for some of the students that we work with. So what do these youth look like? Same as what I talked about at Tier 1, just maybe with a little more intensity, right? And some of the strategies other than the ones that I just mentioned are the wellness plans again. I'm just going to keep putting that on every slide because I really believe in it. There's also screening tools, and the caution with screening tools would be, one, get the parents on board before you're going to screen. I really believe that parents need to know what they're being screened for. And two, do you have the capacity, the people in place, the workforce in place to manage what the outcome of the screening is? Because if we're just going to screen kids and then we don't have a place to refer them to, that's the difficulty. So what relationships have we developed with people that can support if somebody comes out high on the anxiety scales? And then the progress measure piece for me is, once interventions have been put in place, are we going back and looking at them and making sure that that's working? And if we're not doing that, we're not giving the child or the family the feedback loop that you really deserve, because a lot of times when you're in the anxiety piece in life, you don't even realize that you're making improvements. And so the antidote oftentimes to anxiety is knowledge, and knowing the improvements that you're making can be really, really powerful. And also, if you're not making improvements, knowing that something needs to be tweaked, that it's not something that you're wrong in some way, but that something can be tweaked and we can redo our plans with how we manage anxiety. A little bit about Youth Mental Health First Aid. It is an 8-hour training. We have a grant through Project Aware right now that we can provide some free trainings throughout the state. I know Elmbrook is on, and I know we've provided a couple through the grant for Elmbrook. And other places throughout the state, especially I think in like the Green Bay area, we really had a lot of saturated trainings there. And it basically is giving you some mental health literacy so that you kind of understand the language around mental health issues. But it's also giving you some anti-stigma messages that I think are really important. And it gives you a 5-step approach to listening and being able to support somebody having emotional crises, including anxiety crises. The other thing is managing the acute symptoms. And so a lot of people will have a transient anxiety experience after a situation or an experience. In our town and community that I was working in central Wisconsin area, we had a huge hailstorm, like huge. ginormous hailstorm. And a lot of kids after that hailstorm, because it was right at the end of the school day, and a lot of them were kind of caught in parking lots and different things and watching things get smashed. When we manage acute issues that happen and we kind of triage those issues and we have conversations around them, it's so important to bring the anxiety back down so that that trauma loop is not, re-intensified for people. So how we manage the acute symptoms of anxiety is important. I talk about a little bit adaptations, accommodations, modifications. Now this is language that I know our other side of DPI works on in the compliance special ed department. I'm not talking about it in that way because a lot of kids with mental health challenges don't necessarily need IEP or special education services, but they still need adaptations, accommodations, and modifications. We need to be aware. For my stepson, the algebra class, yes, that was the place he should be in, but he could not be in. So to keep pushing him to be in that algebra class, it was only going to make him more and more behaviorally challenging. And so listening to what the youth is saying about what they need is really important. Accommodations used with caution, though. Sometimes accommodations without exposure therapy will actually perpetuate the feeling of I'm not ever going to get good at that, right? As a technical term, going to get good at that. So an example would be my stepdaughter. I didn't think she was ever going to drive a car, yet she needed to drive a car. We wanted her to get a job and to be able to drive to that job and not have to follow her on to college and drive her to where she needed to go. And so that was a huge life skill that she needed. And so exposure therapy was, let's just do the parking lot for a week and really navigate how the car feels. Let's do the 1 mile loop around the block. You only have to make right turns. We're not even going to try left turns. Then the next week, let's add on 1 left turn. Let's add on a block. And so it's exposing to brief and successful interventions and ways that they can build upon their skills, if that makes sense. So yes, it's accommodating, but it's also providing, here's where we want to get to in the end. Our current accommodations will help you now, but here's our goal. How can we work to get there? And then, again, just capturing the youth voice in planning. Let's see. I just share this as an example of some of the screening tools I mentioned in the previous. There's many that are out there, and a lot of them don't have any proprietary to them. And so then when we look at anxiety in the tier 3, those are those really intense anxiety kids. So a couple stories I can share is working with a youth that literally had to be wheeled out of the ACT testing, had literally frozen during an ACT testing and had to be put in a wheelchair and taken out. Or another kiddo I worked with that had a severe trauma experience, witnessed a person in his life die by a car accident. And then what did we need to do to come together and collaborate to help support his ability to still work at his academics, yet really let his brain heal from the extreme trauma that he had experienced. So those are just two extreme examples. And then I also think about anxiety on a continuum of sometimes in your life, your anxiety will increase to a point where it becomes debilitating, but it doesn't mean that's always going to be there, and it will decrease. So for example, a woman that I was working with was going through a divorce, and under extreme stress, she was getting up multiple times a night and checking all the doors and gas being off and all that stuff. Very temporary experience to stress. It was debilitating because she wasn't getting enough sleep. And so we know that sleep restores us, and it was actually exacerbating her anxiety. And so there's going to be times where some people are in that tier 3 place, right? But it doesn't mean that they're going to stay there if we give them the right supports. So here are some of the resources and strategies that I've identified for school-age youth. The emotional regulation plans, we do have those available at DPI. I'm not sure, I'd have to give Tim the link where they are located, but those are really very specific plans that help youth identify, how does my body feel when this is happening, and when my body is feeling this way, what are some of the supports and interventions that I can use and that I need. There are also crises and safety planning, and a lot of times, let's say when a youth is discharged from a hospitalization stay, we want to make sure that they have crises and safety planning in place, but also to prevent any hospitalization stays, we can do crises and safety planning. Who can I go to? Who do I need to talk to? Anxiety is linked to suicidality because it's so debilitating for a person to just feel like I will never get better. And then post-crises debriefing, we talked about that a little, but it's just really important that after a crisis happens, we provide new opportunities for kids to have a plan in place that's going to work for them. I don't know how many teams I've been on where I've sat with the team and I've developed like the best plan ever, and the kid just doesn't cooperate when they come back. The problem became is I never asked the kid what would work for you. Would that work for you to be able to go down to the office and talk to somebody, or would that not? And so making sure that our post-crisis debriefing encourages that. With reentry planning, those are times where I want you to imagine that you've had like your worst meltdown day. I mean, maybe even you threw things or like spouted something out to somebody that you loved and really hurt their feelings. And I want you to imagine that you have that day in school. And maybe next hour you have to go back to class in front of your peers. And we know peers are so kind about those meltdowns, right? They're just very understanding, usually. Or you have to go back the next week after a major meltdown. And so oftentimes as adults, we know that we can have our meltdowns at home in private. But with kids, prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. There's no judgment of where it's appropriate to have a meltdown or not, right? And so when we have reentry, what are we doing to plan and to make sure that the class knows what's happening? Talking to the class and debriefing with the class. Here's what happened, and here's the supports that she's saying she needs as she comes back today. And in some of our schools, we do restorative practice, where we circle up and we talk in circles about what just happened and how we can best support one another through that. With the CST, the Coordinated Services Teams, and the Comprehensive Community Service, not all kids are going to qualify for the CCS programs, but most kids could get involved with Coordinated Service Team, where we do wraparound models and everybody kind of comes together with those kiddos to support them. After listening to Hugh, I'm also going to put up here Parent Peer Specialist in the future. That will be on my new slide, because we are seeing really profound empowerment of parents, which a profoundly empowered parent can help their child better. And so the parent peer specialist is not for the anxious youth, but the parent peer specialist is for the parent of an anxious youth. And I think that would be a really important connection for people to make. A lot of times I hear, how do we motivate schools to come together around this topic? I think clearly defining what the role is for them, what the time is, the time commitment on some of these teams is really important. Making sure we do the perspective shift of youth would do well if they can. I also want to say parents would do well if they can. And then if we can even take it one step further, teachers would do well if they can. Our teachers are vastly under-supported with mental health knowledge. It's part of where youth mental health first aid comes in. It gives them a lot of literacy around mental health. I'll stand in a room of over 100 educators and ask them to raise their hand if they've received any education around mental health in their undergrad or graduate work. I get very few hands up. Yet 1 in 5 of their students in front of them are coming in with significant mental health needs. And so that's, a perspective shift I really encourage people to have too. That we all are just working together and we need to put our fingers away and just kind of get to the table and work together. Balancing the needs of the individual student in the learning environment. If we can lead with that discussion, that's really helpful. And a teacher's main and administrator's main objective is to really maximize the classroom learning time. But if we don't have the tools to manage the issues, they're not really in a learning brain mode, right? This is not exhaustive. I mean, there's lots of stuff out there. Mindfulness, brain breaks, all those things that really support youth in school in general. Social emotional learning competencies I know we're working on as a team, and if we can, support all those things, that would be helpful too. I recently have run across, and I didn't have a chance to put it on here, a thing called The Mighty, which is a free subscription you can get. It has amazing YouTube videos on there of kids telling, here's what's going on in my head when I'm feeling anxious. And so if you want to, incorporate that in a professional development with your staff, those videos can kind of lead into some deeper discussions around what kind of supports. So as I'm ending, and Tim wanted me to come up with questions, right?
Yes.
You may have some, but I also have a few. In the work that you've been doing with youth, how might you now reframe a youth's behavior where before it might have been manipulative or resistant? What shift have you made in that thought? And then with that shift, what might shift in your discipline practices, interventions, and treatment of that youth? So as you move through your group discussions, those are two things that kind of came to my head. What else did you think about?
I thought about the ones that you sent me beforehand.
Yep, what were those?
So I wrote them down. They were great. I loved them. They were, what supports or services do you see in your schools right now? What needs to be in that plan in those places? So that whole discussion about what supports and services are there, what supports and services could be helpful. In what ways are your communities coming together around mental health issues and connecting that way? Is I know that we have some sites that have multiple players from different parts, different agencies, different organizations. What is being done to sort of coordinate and bring that work together? What connections can you make today? And then what challenges are parents or families needing supports around? Where are they struggling in the area of anxiety? And in this case, anxiety and autism. Mm-hmm. So I think that whole discussion about, and even, one of the things that I really like about that framework is I was sitting back thinking, these aren't just things to do at school.
No.
These are things I could do with my family.
Yeah.
I can do those check-ins. I can make sure that I'm not throwing these surprises on my anxious child. That whole story of accommodations, very similar to how we taught our son to drive as well. And so we taught him drive. He finally got his license. And then he didn't want to drive. Once he had his license, he's like, great, I'm done. Thanks very much. We're like, no, that's not the point. This is not a checkbox. Yes, this is no, you need to continue to drive. And so, we let him do these little trips. And then he finally found something that he really wanted to go to. Happened to be an adults, a game night with the Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin, a board-free game night.
Yeah.
And I'm like, Hunter, I'm at work. Your mom has danced. Sorry, it's in Madison. Well, I think I could do it. Great. So he put on the GPS and he got himself to Madison College and he got home and he loved it. It was great and it was, again, empowering. But he didn't just do that right after he got his license. This is 2.5 years later of driving around Stoughton that he was finally able to drive to Madison. So it's those little steps, but it's those accommodations, those small successes of helping that child with anxiety that they can build on. So I really thought that, everything that you're saying was very applicable, outside of the school framework. This is good stuff for life. So I really appreciate it. So one of the discussions you might have is how can we work these frameworks into where we're working? How can we work these frameworks into our connections in our community? How can we embed them in what we do? So a lot of stuff that you could talk about. Fantastic. So please join me in thanking Christie.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And so we are going to break off of the feed for the site discussions. I know some people are just joining for parts of the day and where they can. I just want to let you know that if you have registered either beforehand or registered day of at your site with your email, you will get a feedback form. We do want to figure out what else can we do in this method. Does this method work? All those good questions that we'll ask. If you are joining by your personal computer, if you registered online as saying, I'm going to join by my personal computer, you will get that follow-up email. Matter of fact, if you registered that you were joining at your personal computer and you really didn't sign up and you're not really listening right now, you're getting the email too, because I have no way to tell whether you're there or not. But if you signed on your personal computer and you never registered, please send me an email at tmarkle, M-A-R-K-L-E, at wisc, W-I-S-C.edu. Number one, I need to figure out how many people we're reaching, how is this working, but more importantly, I want you to be able to give us feedback as well. So if I don't know you're listening, I can't give you that opportunity. So please let me know so that I can get you that opportunity. So let us go ahead and spend about 15-20 minutes in discussion. I think there's a lot to talk about, and then take another short break. I know some people will be coming and going.